Hello and welcome to the start of the Shropshire Union Canal on the edge of Wolverhampton. This canal runs from here all the way up to Ellesmere Port, linking the cities of Wolverhampton and Birmingham to the River Mersey. Today we're going to be attempting to ride a 15-mile stretch from here on Route 81 of the National Cycle Network up to Gnosall to link up with the disused Wellington to Stafford Railway, which forms part of Route 55 of the National Cycle Network. We're starting today's ride at Autherley Junction, where the Shropshire Union Canal branches off from the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal and begins its journey towards Ellesmere Port. The first mile and a half of the ride follows Route 81 of the National Cycle Network before it leaves the canal and heads towards Albrighton and Telford. But I want to carry on along the canal to see if we can find a traffic-free route from Wolverhampton to Gnosall, where we can link up with the traffic-free section of Route 55 that runs between Newport and Stafford. The towpath begins on the north side of the canal. If you've come up the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal along Route 81, you take a left to carry on up the towpath, which at this point is a lovely gravel surface. I've chosen to do this ride on my mountain bike today, just because I'm not sure what the surface of the towpath is going to be like. As we head through this lovely park in the Penderford area of Wolverhampton, the surface of the towpath actually turns to tarmac for a short while, and it's lovely riding as we make our way up the side of the canal. As I made my way through this park, I got my first glimpse of somebody doing some fishing in the canal. I'm not sure if that home was successful there with his fishing attempt, but I do know that the path turns back to gravel, and then eventually as we approach the droveway, it turns into a track. I'm riding this in early summer, and it's been fairly dry for the last week or so at the moment this path is absolutely fine, no problem at all. But I can imagine in winter, or after a lot of rain, that this could be quite muddy and quite slippy. However, it wouldn't be long as I make my way up the canal that I would consider a path like this to actually be very good. It's not long before we pass under Wobaston Road and head out of Wolverhampton. As we pass under this bridge, the character of the canal changes, and it really feels like we're out in open countryside as we continue north up the canal. As we leave Wolverhampton, the towpath does begin to deteriorate. You can see it is fairly grown over at this point, but the grass is short. But on this section, as we continue through the open countryside on the edge of Wolverhampton, it still makes for very pleasant riding. The surface of the path does get a little better as we carry on. As you can see, there's no grass on the track here, but it does get quite narrow and quite close up to the side of the canal. I actually struggled a little bit here with my mountain bike because it has got quite wide bars on it. I was catching the hedge on the right. I was a little worried a stray branch in the wrong place might send me off into the canal. Fortunately, I didn't end up in the canal, as these are two local residents I would not want to upset. 2 miles from Autherley Junction, where the canal began, we start to hear the roar of the motorway in the distance. The motorway in question being the M54. But before we pass under the motorway, we need to make our way through this section of towpath which has really deteriorated in quality. I don't know if you can tell by the footage, but it was pretty bumpy at this point and pretty overgrown at the sides. I really did have to look out for stray nettles or brambles coming in from the side, while also being cautious of the surface underneath me. The concrete towpath that runs under the motorway was a welcome relief at this point. The original idea for the M54 was to alleviate heavy traffic on the A5 in this area, and the idea gained extra backing in the 1960s with the development of the new town of Telford. The first section, known as the Wellington Bypass, which is now junction 6 to 7, was completed in 1975, with the 19-mile section from the M6 to Wellington being completed in 1983. With Shropshire being a rural county, there was a lot of opposition to having this motorway driven through this quiet landscape. To help subdue this opposition, you'll find that the section that runs through Shropshire sits much lower than most of the landscape surrounding it, as it was built low down to hide it from the surrounding countryside and help with the noise. There was also 250,000 trees planted along its length to help with the noise further and hide the motorway from view. The M54 from here heads towards Telford, the town named after Thomas Telford, who was the chief engineer of the Shropshire Union Canal. It was not completed in 1835, and it was the last major civil engineering accomplishment of Thomas Telford, although unfortunately he didn't live to see it completed. Not long after passing under the Lower Hatton Bridge, I came to a barrier on the towpath, with a sign to say that it was impassable ahead, although I could see that people had been passing around the left-hand side of this barrier, and with no public roads around, I decided to carry on up the canal to see how far I could make it. And with the towpath looking like this, I thought I wouldn't be able to make it that far, to be honest. I think with the barrier across the towpath, traffic on this stretch had been severely reduced, meaning that the early summer vegetation had really taken over here. There is definitely a track of some sorts under here, but a lot of vegetation sticking in from the sides, and I did catch the odd nettle as I made my way up this section of towpath. The vegetation did unfortunately get worse. I even tried holding the middle of the bars to try and avoid having my hands whipped by the grass as I passed through, but that made me feel a little bit unstable, and as the path is quite close to the canal here, I decided holding the bars on the ends was the best option here. We soon pass under the Monarch's Way, a lengthy walking route based on the escape of King Charles II after the final battle in the Civil War in 1651. The quality of the towpath did improve after passing the Monarch's Way, and after passing under Park Bridge, the quality improved a little bit further as the canal enters a cutting. You can see there's still a fair bit of vegetation at the side of the path, but the track underneath is much smoother and a little bit wider than it was previously, making cycling down this a little bit easier. It's not long before we come to the section of towpath that was considered impassable. It doesn't look too bad from certain angles, but when you get a little bit closer, you can see that the whole towpath here is slipping into the canal, and you can see the water through this rather large crack. However, this is by no means impassable. Use a little bit of common sense and you can safely make your way past this point. And I think the Canal and River Trust who manage the canal know that this is the case, because although there are barriers at either side of this crack in the towpath, these barriers are by no means impassable themselves. They're quite easy to make your way around, and you can see that a lot of people have been doing so. And it looks like this has been the case for quite some time, as the path is worn quite nicely down around these barriers. Moving on as we get closer to the village of Brood, we come to a section of towpath that is extremely muddy. There was a few patches like this that were very muddy and pretty tricky to make my way through. I was certainly glad I was on my mountain bike at this point. Struggling through the mud was worth it. As I made it to the other side, I got a great view of the ornamental Avenue Bridge which leads to Chillington Hall. This bridge really stands out from all the others we've seen so far, which have either been pretty standard canal bridges or very brutalist modern bridges that pass over the canal. This bridge forms part of a grand avenue that leads to Chillington Hall. The current Grade 1 listed structure was built in 1724, but this was actually the third building to be built on the site, with the first being a stone castle built in the 12th century. The lower avenue part of this grand driveway is now a public footpath if you fancy walking part of it. As the canal continues its way north through this deep cutting, the towpath quality is much better, and I really enjoyed riding this section. On the outskirts of Brood, as the canal carries on along an embankment, the towpath really does become brilliant. I started to get my hopes up that the towpath would continue like this for the rest of this journey to Gnosall. As I continued the journey through Brood, the towpath continued to be in great condition, and I had to do my best to not to be tempted by the cheese and the local pub that were advertised to me on my way through. North of Brood, sadly, the towpath does begin to deteriorate again. Although you can see here, the surface is perfectly fine to cycle along, and it's not actually too badly overgrown at this point. This section of canal from Brood up to the A5 is absolutely arrow straight, and this is one of the trademark ways that Thomas Telford built his canals. Early canals were built to follow the lay of the land, and so often meandered across the countryside, but by the time this canal was built in the 1830s, Thomas Telford had the confidence to drive the canal in a straight line through the countryside, using large embankments and deep cuttings to make sure that the canal stayed level and reduce the need for locks along its length. And by the time this canal opened in 1835, it really did need all the benefits of that faster journey time provided by a direct route and as little locks as possible, because by this time railways were really starting to threaten the viability of canals moving forward. This section of canal from Autherley Junction to Nantwich Basin was the last part of what we now know as the Shropshire Union Canal to be opened, with the sections from Nantwich up to the River Mersey being opened much earlier in the 1700s. And as we battle our way through a slightly overgrown towpath again, we come to the Shropshire Aqueduct, which passes over the A5 and gives us the original name of this section of canal which ran from Autherley Junction, Wolverhampton to Nantwich. I'm not sure how readable it is, but on the front of this aqueduct it says, "The Birmingham and Liverpool Canal, Thomas Telford, Engineer, 1832. This imaginative name was given to the canal because it linked the River Mersey in Liverpool to the canal network of the West Midlands, including the Venice of the North, also known as Birmingham. This iron aqueduct, known as the Shropshire Aqueduct, crosses over the A5. Thomas Telford pioneered the use of iron aqueducts on canals, from his first one at Longden-upon-Tern, just outside Telford, and his most famous one, the Pontcycyllte Aqueduct, which towers almost 40 metres above the River Dee below. If you want to watch my video on that, I'll leave a link in the description. But we need to move on, because we're about halfway along our route here, and we need to carry on the rest of the way to Gnosall. And at this point again, the towpath does get a little bit overgrown, unfortunately. There is still a path underneath here, it's just very overgrown at the sides. After heading through yet another cutting, which really demonstrates the amount of effort that went into building this canal as it cuts through the landscape, we get to the outskirts of Wheaton Aston, where we find that the towpath really improves in quality, and we find our first and only lock on this journey along the canal. That is if we ignore the stop lock at the start of the canal. And it really demonstrates the determination of Thomas Telford to make this canal efficient, and the reason it was able to compete with the railways, as the less locks, the quicker the traffic was able to move along the canal. In the mid-1840s, when the canal was taken over by the Shropshire Union Railways and Canal Company, giving it its current name, the Shropshire Union Canal, there was some discussion about turning the canal into a railway. But due in no small part to the efficient route that Thomas Telford created, it was kept as a canal and was used heavily by commercial traffic all the way up until the First World War, with some commercial traffic carrying on right up until the 1960s. The lock here at Wheaton Aston drops the water level by 7 feet, and as well as being the only lock that will pass on our journey today as we head to Gnosall, it's actually the only lock on the canal between the start at Autherley Junction, Wolverhampton, and Market Drayton, a testament to the impressive engineering that went into this canal. The towpath heading into Wheaton Aston is one of the best stretches on the Shropshire Union Canal that we've gone through so far, apart from maybe that first stretch that's part of the National Cycle Network as we headed through Wolverhampton. As we head through Wheaton Aston itself, the canal heads into yet another cutting, and the path here still continues to be of good quality. There are places where it's a little bit muddy, but generally I found this a very nice stretch to cycle down. As we cycle further away from Wheaton Aston and further away from civilization, the quality of the towpath really does deteriorate. The section between Wheaton Aston and Gnosall has probably the worst stretches of towpath on this journey that we're taking today. There really are some pretty tough pits to make your way through. There's quite a few sections along here that are very overgrown and very difficult to cycle through. And as well as being overgrown, there were some sections that were quite bumpy underneath. I was definitely glad that I was on my mountain bike doing this section of towpath. I think this journey from Wolverhampton to Gnosall would be possible to do on a hybrid bike or a gravel type bike, but definitely the best bike for this would be a mountain bike, and I think I'd only use the other type of bikes if I was doing this as part of a longer journey. The towpath wasn't bad for this entire part of the journey between Wheaton Aston and Gnosall, and I did look forward to the sections of canal that dipped into cuttings because I generally knew there'd be less vegetation in these sections and the towpath would be easier to ride. That did mean, of course, there'd be more mud in these cuttings, but generally the towpath was of better quality as we dipped into them. Just past High-on Bridge, we reach High-on Wharf, a lovely scenic spot, only slightly ruined by the sound of a diesel generator. The next bridge on from High on Wharf is where the towpath swaps sides of the canal. It moves from the east side over to the west side. On one of these bridges where we double back on ourselves to make our way over the canal. You may initially wonder why the need to double back on ourselves. Why didn't they just put the ramp at the other side so you could carry on straight over the bridge without having to change direction? Well, the reason for this is quite simple, but also quite clever. And you'll find many bridges like this across the canal network. They're designed like this so when a horse is pulling a boat up the canal, it is able to cross over the canal without having to disconnect from the boat, thus saving time and effort and speeding up transit along the canal, something that Thomas Telford was very much in favour of. Unfortunately, swapping sides did not help the towpath. Although there was a nice bit next to the bridge, it did soon deteriorate and become very overgrown again. And at this spot there was quite a few nettles and brambles that I had to do my best to avoid. And just to add to the challenge, in places along the stretch it also came right up against the side of the canal. So as well as having to avoid rogue nettles and brambles, I had to do my best to avoid any rogue bumps throwing me into the canal. As we close in on Gnosall, our final destination, the canal enters another cutting, and it gets particularly muddy at this point. I think this is the muddiest section of towpath that we've had to navigate through on this whole journey. There are sections where it is much better and you're able to cycle at a good pace, but do watch out for the mud here. After continuing through this particularly deep cutting, on the outskirts of Gnosall we come to the Cowley Tunnel. This is a 74-metre long tunnel cut through the local sandstone. The tunnel was originally designed to be much longer than it is today. However, when the engineers started to cut into the land here, they found it to be unstable, so the length of the tunnel was reduced down to its current 74 metres. As we head into the tunnel from the south side, you can see that it's nicely faced with bricks. At 74 metres long, it does get quite dark in the middle of here, but I was certainly able to cycle through with no problems without a light. The towpath is of really good quality here, as it continues into the village of Gnosall. Having a smooth towpath is great at the best of times, but particularly useful when you're cycling through a dimly lit tunnel. Looking back at the north entrance of the tunnel, you can really see that this has just been cut through the rock. There's no supporting brick arch underneath. From here to where the canal meets the old Stafford to Wellington Railway, the towpath is in excellent condition and it really makes for very pleasant riding. Gnosall Council look after this section of towpath that heads through the village, and they really have made an effort to make it a pleasant place to cycle and walk. And it's not long before we reach the bridge that took the old railway over the canal here. Interestingly enough, the canal and the railway were eventually owned by the same company, the Shropshire Union Canal and Railways Company. From here we want to link up with Route 55 of the National Cycle Network that runs along that old section of railway track. We need to make our way under the railway bridge, which is bridge 35A, the A telling us that actually it wasn't there originally when the canal was built, and then we take a left up the embankment to the railway. And once on this old railway, you can head south towards Newport or north towards Stafford along this traffic-free route. If you want to watch my video on that route, I'll leave a link in the description. And so that's it, we've finished our journey today. We've made it from Wolverhampton to Gnosall, linking up routes 81 and route 55 of the National Cycle Network using a traffic-free route. The surface of this route along the canal is best described as mixed, with it being pretty poor in places along this route that we've taken today. So if you are feeling adventurous or particularly determined to stay off the roads, this could be the route for you, especially if you're looking to make your way from the West Midlands up to Stafford and Stoke. By using this section of a canal, you could actually make your way from the centre of Birmingham to the edge of Stafford without using a single road. Then using Route 5 of the National Cycle Network, you could make your way from Stafford to Stoke, and then from Stoke to Congleton using the Biddulph Valley Way. So there's a potential route from Birmingham to Congleton, which is 95% traffic free. If you'd be interested to see me putting a video together on that, please do let me know in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed today's video, and if you have, please do make the effort to subscribe to the channel. It's completely free and really helps keep the channel afloat. And if you want to buy me a beer to say thanks, you can do so via the link in the description. Thank you very much for watching, and happy cycling.